Hasan was wrong. His main issue in this video is the Russian bombing campaign, and he kind of offhandedly makes this comment about the Crimean Bridge.
What Ukraine did in blowing up the Crimean Bridge was also a ridiculous act of war.
The Ukrainian targeting of the Crimean Bridge was 100% justifiable, and a lot of this, it feels like almost like he just wants to both sides it. It feels like he's making this mistake, this both sides mistake. And not only was he wrong, he was proudly wrong. This morning, I was, scrolling on YouTube, seeing what YouTube was talking about, and I saw Hasan uploaded a new video. I'm not really a constant Hasan viewer. I am subscribed, of course, because as I'm subscribed to basically every political Twitch commentator, and I see it's a video on Ukraine, so I'm like, oh, this is a topic I care a lot about. Obviously, I went to Ukraine, have a lot of friends in Ukraine, and so I'm interested in what he has to say about the recent Russian bombing campaign, right? The title is Russia Bombs Kiev Once Again. The thumbnail is, Kiev being bombed and him looking very disappointed. And so I play the first minute and a half of the video, and I immediately had some problems with what he had to say about the Ukrainian targeting of the Russian Crimean Bridge that they put up during the occupation of Crimea. And so I wanted to play this and show you guys what he had to say, since he condemns the Ukrainian attack on Russian logistics. Let's listen to what he has to say. Now, to be clear, his main issue in this video is the Russian bombing campaign, and he kind of offhandedly makes this comment about the Crimean Bridge, but I think it's important that we talk about it.
Good morning, Robin. Kyiv is on edge. We woke up to the sound of several loud bangs at just after 8 a.m. Smoke rising from the city center. This is a busy intersection, where hundreds of cars pass through during rush hour. And as far as we know, there were no military targets here. There were attacks on infrastructure in Kyiv as well, but also civilian areas with no apparent strategic or military significance, including a park and a pedestrian bridge that has no other purpose other than sightseeing. This is the biggest attack on the capital since the beginning of the war, and the first attack on the city center, making this a clear escalation. And as you say, Putin saying he personally ordered these strikes.
This is straight up terrorism. When Putin says, oh, well, what goes around comes around, you shouldn't have blew up our bridge. And I saw plenty of people saying, well, that's technically infrastructure. It's valid to blow that up. Ultimately, it goes back to who struck the first blow. And the country that struck the first blow is still Vladimir Putin, is still Russia. So what ended up happening is, regardless, state-sponsored terrorism in the form of state war, military action, started when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine. What Ukraine did in blowing up the Crimean Bridge was also a ridiculous act of war. I don't care if you get mad at me for saying this. Blowing up civilian infrastructure that civilians utilize because military equipment passed through it. The bridge was used for Russian military sources. I know there are a lot of civilian targets and civilian infrastructure that oftentimes are valid targets. There's rules to war. I think what Russia did in Western Ukraine is worse than what Ukraine did in Crimea. But I still think that what Ukraine did in Crimea is bad. Of course, what Russia is doing is significantly worse. What Russia has been doing since day one is significantly worse because they are the ones who are invading. None of this would happen if they hadn't invaded. This is why my main point has always been, this is why war is awful across the board. Because civilians end up getting killed in the process. I can't sit here and fucking act like, bombing civilian targets and civilian infrastructure is ultimately a good thing and justifiable. You know what I mean? Like, that's crazy. The main perpetrators of the circumstance are, of course, the Russian forces and Vladimir Putin. I don't think anyone has an issue with that take. I mean, or if you do, you're a fucking psycho. You're out of your mind.
Okay, so this is what I wanted to talk about. It was this take right here. So, first off, of course, I believe Russia's the instigator. I don't disagree with him on that. Of course, I believe Russia struck the first blow. Don't disagree with him on that. So, I feel like Hasan should have learned his lesson by now. Like, Hasan was wrong when it came to American intelligence about the invasion of Ukraine.
Burns is an
Immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Anonymous Gifter, thank you for giving the tier 1 sub to HasanAbi, great fan, who is a great fan of the channel. He was wrong about that. And not only was he wrong, he was proudly wrong. Like, he was releasing videos like, it's been 7 days and Ukraine has still not been invaded. He was like really bragging about it with like TikToks, like, haha, look at this. Hey, we're gonna stream later today. Hey, wow, Ukraine hasn't been invaded. Shocker. Haha. And then the announced annexation or the announced recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk with the moving in of Russian troops. He was like, oh, okay, this is an invasion of Ukrainian territory, technically. So this is an invasion, but they haven't invaded the rest of Ukraine. That would be, and he even said this, if they invade the rest of Ukraine, that would be my Tim Pool moment. He called it the Tim Pool moment in reference to that time that Tim Pool was talking about a 49-state landslide. 49-state landslide. That was in reference to if Tim Pool saying that if Trump endorsed marijuana legalization, it would be a 49-state landslide. A ridiculous statement, of course. And then Russia did invade the rest of Ukraine, and he had a bunch of egg on his face. He looked like a clown. He was historically wrong. I mean, he couldn't have been more wrong about what he said. I mean, just 2 + 2 = 5 type wrong, right? Then he made comments about the Russian annexation of Crimea being justified. Then he made comments about Euromaidan and the coup and these calls between American officials about installing Poroshenko and who are these snipers really, and like a bunch of like conspiracy theories about the Euromaidan movement, which was a democratic revolution after Yanukovych tried to outlaw protesting, pulled out of a deal that the vast majority of Ukrainians supported with the European Union, and brutalized and murdered protesters. And that wasn't just in Kiev. I interviewed a Euromaidan protester from Kharkiv. It was across the whole country that the Euromaidan movement came from. This is actually a big point where sentiment in Ukraine largely turned against Russia, because this is also when Russia illegally invaded and annexed Crimea, where they put guns. This was admitted to by war criminal Igor Girkin, who's the former defense minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, the fake proxy state that the Russians have put in eastern Ukraine. By the way, check out the government ministers for the occupation forces. Many of them are literally former FSB agents, or the vast majority of them are Russian citizens. Actually, 90% of the people who are, occupation forces, politicians in these fake little semi-republics that Russia has put up in Ukraine are Russian citizens. So this idea that it comes from like this, this is from a popular sentiment from locals, but basically none of the government ministers they've appointed are locals. They're all FSB agents. Very funny, very silly. Igor Girkin admitted that they put guns to the backs of these politicians in Crimea to make them dissolve the government and declare this annexation after the fake and phony rigged referendum, and after which they murdered Tartar activists, dumped them in rivers. I mean, Hasan has been wrong not once, not twice, not thrice, but like 4 times. He's been wrong again and again and again and again and again on this issue. And a lot of this, it feels like almost like he just wants to both sides it. It feels like. And once again, it feels like he's making this mistake, this both sides mistake, saying like, well, of course, all of these bombing of civilians, the surface-to-air missile attack in Zaporozhye, which killed 20 civilians, the missile attacks in Kiev, which, by the way, destroyed a lot of the buildings that I hanged out in. I mean this very seriously. If I was back in Ukraine for just a few more days before I left, there is a decent chance this attack on the first day would have struck a building I was in, because multiple of the buildings that were struck were buildings that I regularly hang out in. Obviously, when I go back, I won't hang out in them again. But I mean, we know people who, and I don't want to go into specifics, who died from these strikes that are no longer with us. We know people who have been injured by these strikes. Really horrific bombing. For this moment to basically become a both sides quickly like a both sides moment, like, oh, Ukraine did bad, Russia did bad, they target civilian infrastructure to cities, Russia targets civilian infrastructure to city. I mean, obviously the Russians are worse. Let me just be clear with you guys. The Ukrainian targeting of the Crimean Bridge was 100% justifiable under the rules of war, under just basic norms around war. The Crimean Bridge was being used to transport Russian logistics. Not only was it being used to transport Russian logistics, this isn't like it was just like a random bridge in the middle of nowheres that old grannies used to bicycle over, and once in a while a Russian soldier will wander over the bridge when trying to get to a random guard tower outpost. This is one of the most important veins, arteries. I would call it one of the main arteries of the Russian war machine in Ukraine. I mean, I've shown the pictures on stream before of just rows upon rows of miles of tanks, miles of artillery guns, miles of trucks, miles of boxes of ammunition, of grenades, of artillery shells, of rockets, of rocket launcher systems, soldiers, transport group troops, armored vehicles being transported over the Crimean Bridge, which, by the way, was built in occupied territory, mind you, being transported over the Crimean Bridge into Ukraine and then sent into Kherson so they could try to take Mykolaiv. In fact, they launched the invasion from Crimea by transporting troops over the bridge. That's how they took Mariupol. That's how they took the city of Kherson. That's how they took Metsiopol, where they then deposed locally elected leaders and replaced them with Russian puppets. And FSB agents, mind you. That's how they did all of this. And then you are going to seriously look Ukraine in the face and say, that was very naughty. It was very naughty that you did what every other major military in the world would have done in your position. The United States would have done it. The Soviet Union, if they were still alive, would have done it. If the Russians were in Ukraine's position, they would do it. Israel, Palestine, if Sankara to Pol Pot to Stalin to Churchill to FDR to every major historical figure, man. Every single major historical figure would have made the same decision in Ukraine's position. Every major country, every minor country, Luxembourg, man, Tanutuva, if it was still an independent nation, would have made the same decision in Ukraine's position. I cannot think of a single world leader, unless they're literally suicidal in nature, like some sort of Manchurian candidate, that wouldn't have done the same thing given the opportunity in Ukraine's position to take out one of the most vital arteries of the Russian war machine. Once you use quote-unquote civilian infrastructure, built up in an occupation, by the way, quote-unquote civilian infrastructure, once you turn that into a vital artery of a war machine, that is fair game. Just period, end of paragraph. It becomes fair game. You really expect any military force not to target the logistical lines of an opposing army? This is just warfare 101. This is, I hate to be mean, but this is just war. This is how war works. War is mean, war is brutal, but this is totally within the norms of warfare. This isn't like torturing children or raping civilians or building or filling up mass graves in Izium like the Russian army did. This is targeting the logistics of your military opponent. The Ukrainians have done it to the Russians before, and the Russians have done it to the Ukrainians before. We did it to the Confederates during the Civil War. The Confederates tried to do it to us during the Civil War. We did it to the Germans during World War II. We did it to the Japanese. The Japanese tried to do it to us. The Germans tried to do it to us during the Battle of the Bulge and other military skirmishes that we had. The Soviets did it to the Germans did it to the Soviets. Part of the reason why the Germans wanted to capture Moscow was because it was a major rail hub. I mean, this is just warfare. This is just warfare. Sherman did it to Atlanta. I mean, this just feels silly. This just feels like saying both sides in order to feel impartial, or in order to make sure that you don't give Ukraine too much credit or you don't defend them too much. Like, I don't understand the motivation. Now, the Russians claim that 3 civilians died during the explosion. that is something you could be like, okay, did Ukraine take the proper precautions to protect civilians during said strike? Did Ukraine know about this? Did Ukraine do this? Did Ukraine do its best to protect civilians during that? Those are valid questions. Those are questions I would like to see Hasan ask. Those are questions that I would like to see major commentators ask. But instead, it's about civilian infrastructure. Why is that? Well, the reason why it's about civilian infrastructure is because this is the conversation the Kremlin has specifically designed for all of you, for me, Hasan, and every major commentator online to have. This is the conversation they want to have, because if the Kremlin can go on TV and say our civilian infrastructure was targeted, therefore, when we target water supplies, when we target electrical grids, when we target hospitals, when we target playgrounds, as we saw in the report earlier during the segment, that's perfectly fine because the Ukrainians did it by targeting this bridge. So if they can convince you that it was unjustifiable for the Ukrainians to target the bridge, then they could use it as a whataboutism, an accusation in the mirror, to be like, oh, well, the Ukrainians did it, why can't we do it? Even though the difference between targeting a city's electrical supply and water supply, which is integral for civilians to live, is very different than targeting a bridge in occupied territory that is being used to transport missiles that will then be fired at playgrounds. Very different. One is within the norms of war, the other is way outside the norms of war. And to give this any legitimacy is embarrassing. It is embarrassing, and it shows Hasan's inability to reflect about why he has been wrong again and again and again and again and again about this war. It's ridiculous, man. It's ridiculous, man. And there's a reason why when I go to Ukraine, somehow somebody halfway across the world brings up Hasan to me. Isn't that strange? That somebody halfway across the world in the city of Kharkiv, a city being bombarded by the Russian military, during a conversation with me, during an interview, brings that name up to me? Not in a moment of praise, but in a moment of, I've heard this person takes before, they're just so terrible. They didn't bring up Roger Walters. They didn't bring up any of the other celebrities who have been horrifically wrong about this war. They brought up Hasan. And honestly, I think that's kind of embarrassing. The fact that somebody would take time out of an interview to bring you up when they're trying to talk about their city being targeted. I mean, it just shows how much many Ukrainians lack respect for this type of commentary. This type of both sides nonsense. This isn't a both sides. People say, oh, foreign policy is more difficult than good and evil. Not always. Not always. If there's shades of gray in everything, of course. But this is as close to good and evil as you can get in foreign policy. When you look at Yemen, you can't get this type of clearness. When you look at a million different civil wars, like in Libya, between the GNA and Khalifa Haftar, even if the GNA is better than Haftar, there's still many more shades of gray. Here, it's nearly as close as you can get. And we need to stop entertaining this both sides nonsense for what? Cordiality's sake? Just to be cordial? I just can't understand how he seems to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. It's quite frankly very disappointing. Very disappointing. But Hasan said Russia is clearly in the wrong. He says Russia's in the wrong. Yes, Russia's primarily in the wrong. I agree. But he entertains something that is wrong, which is the idea that that by Ukraine targeting a major artery of the Russian war machine, that is unbelievable. That is a bad act Ukraine did. How dare they? That's bad. I mean, they didn't strike first. Obviously, they're the major victim, but don't target these arteries of the war machine. This is something that has been used by civilians. If the standard is something gets used by civilians so you never strike it, then how are you going to do any street by street, room by room combat in major battles like Stalingrad or the Battle of Berlin, where soldiers inevitably, due to the nature of that type of close quarters fighting, are eventually going to take up military positions in abandoned hospitals and abandoned schools, which happened, by the way, during the battles in Bucha, and where Russian soldiers occupied schools and then Ukrainian soldiers occupied schools that were abandoned. Was that civilian infrastructure? Was that used by civilians before the war? Yes, absolutely. But once it is occupied by soldiers and being used by military purposes and they're firing RPGs out of the windows, that is a valid military target. You cannot expect any military to be seeing something being used against them to destroy them and say, well, I guess I just got to let that stand. I guess I got to... It'd be really mean. It'd be really mean if I stopped that guy from stabbing me, because that knife has also been used to cut carrots. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. This is just the nature of war. Attacking a bridge is okay, but civilian death is always bad. When Soviets killed German civilians in Berlin, that was also bad. Yes, I agree with that. Of course I agree civilian deaths are bad. And that's why I made sure to state that they should have done everything in every circumstance to protect civilians to the highest extent possible. But that does not mean that you do not target something just because it either at one point was being used by civilians or even sometimes continued to be used by civilians, if it is being used to destroy your country, destroy you, and kill people. I mean, seriously, if Russian soldiers went into a school, an abandoned school, and took up military positions, do we expect the Ukrainians to say, well, no, we're not going to blow that up? I mean, they might be firing at us, but I mean, I would hate to blow up that school. Sadly, you're at a point of no return once you've done that. That's what war is. You can say I sound callous, but reality is sometimes cold. Reality is sometimes cold. Reality is sometimes cold. Israel says that they have to blow up schools because it has militants. Is that okay? Oh my God. Okay, let me be clear. If Hamas goes into an abandoned school and starts launching rockets at like Israeli civilians, yes, then that would be totally justifiable, because it is no longer being used for a civilian purpose. It is being used for a military purpose. Just like if the Israeli military took up position in a school or in a hospital, an abandoned hospital, an abandoned school, and started firing at Palestinian cities, it would be completely legitimate for Hamas to strike that, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or whatever militant group was fighting with the Israeli army. And I'm talking about the laws of war. I'm talking about norms around War. That's just how wars always worked. That's how wars always worked. That's how war is. Let me ask you a question. If you were a commander of a local battalion or a local soldiers group or whatever it is, and you saw a bunch of your enemies, whatever they are, we'll say they're the French because it's funny, and they take up position in a hospital, an abandoned hospital, and they start shooting at you, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? Do you just say, well, I guess we die. It is what it is. No, you fire at them. You defend yourself. You don't run away. You guys, okay, we don't have, okay, I can tell many of you do not have military experience. Just negotiate, of course. Yeah. The thing is, Israel will say this about everything. Obviously, Israel has lied when it comes to its targeting of positions in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and stuff. Obviously, they have lied. I'm talking about the basics of the norms of war. Okay? The basics of the norms of war is if a military group takes up civilian positions, positions in a hospital, in a school, or anything, these things, then they become military targets. If they start firing at you and using it in that purpose, yeah, it becomes a military target. I don't know what you want me to say. What do you want me to say? What do you want me to say? They can shoot at me as much as they want. There's nothing we can do. Obviously, we must do everything to protect civilians. That's why I'm talking about abandoned buildings, right? And that stuff like that. But if we talking about like, okay, what if there's one civilian, two civilians? Then we're getting into extremely complicated moral calculus. But the concept we're talking about right here is about a bridge and just the fact that it has been used by civilians, civilian infrastructure, but now it's being used to transport weapons to go kill Ukrainians. It is a major artery of the Russian war machine. It's not just a random bridge, it's a major bridge used by the Russians to transport troops into Ukraine. It is a legitimate military target, absolutely. Just on the basis of whether, not if, oh, it was a good the civilians died or anything like that. Obviously it was terrible, the civilians died. But on the basis of it was a valid military target or not, it absolutely was. Absolutely. Absolutely. Below the fifth column is a vet, and he made a great video about bridge as a valid military target. Okay, let's look at it actually. I'm curious.
Well, howdy there, Internet people. It's Bo again. So today we are going to talk about bridges and various kinds of bridges and all of the discussion that's going on about bridges. Because there are people who are either uninformed or they are intentionally misframing something. So we're going to kind of go through it. I'm picking this just because it's one of 100 people talking about it and using this framing. It's insane to me that this guy, I'm this guy by the way, is talking about a deliberate attack on civilian infrastructure. Civilian infrastructure. Is it though? Is a bridge used to move troops and supplies? Is that civilian infrastructure? It's a military objective. It's been a military objective since there were bridges. In fact, I'm fairly certain that if you could go back to prehistory, you would find men in loincloths with sharpened sticks fighting over the shallow part of the river. Anybody who is trying to tell you that a bridge used to move troops and supplies is civilian infrastructure either knows nothing about war or is deliberately misleading you and misframing this.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about something else as a comparison. Let's talk about all the Ukrainian bridges that have been hit by Ukrainians. Everybody's talking about how Russia hit civilian infrastructure. That's fine. I mean, you can talk about that if you want to, but really that's kind of a whataboutism. It's showing the nature of war. It's better to point to Ukraine taking out Ukrainian bridges because that shows it's a military objective. It's something to cut routes, slow advances. It's a military thing. Taking out bridges has always been a military thing. In fact, if somebody's initial video talking about their assessment of what's going to happen, if that didn't include Ukraine dropping their own bridges, I would doubt their assessments, since I know somebody's going to ask that.
One of the major failures of the Ukrainian military early on in the war was their inability to destroy the bridges over the Dnepr River, leading to the city of Kherson, which their failure to do it, which seemed to be largely due to collaborators who worked with the Russian occupiers and murderers. allowed that bridge to stay open even after it was ordered to be destroyed, which allowed the Russian military to capture the city of Kherson and, of course, lead to them doing many brutal things during their occupation of the city, which has seen a lot of partisan activity against the Russians. That wouldn't have been immoral or evil or wrong for the Ukrainians to do it either if they were to successfully carry that out. But that doesn't mean that the Ukrainian government is brutalizing its own citizens. In fact, they are blowing up the bridge specifically to defend the citizens in the city of Kherson and to stop the Russians from getting to those civilians and brutalizing them as they did once they crossed the river. The only difference here is they're targeting the weapons that are coming in to brutalize said same civilians.
February 10th, let's talk about the futures of Ukraine and Russia. That was mine. It's that common. In that video, I say something to the effect of, you know, it doesn't take a lot of people. You just need a few who know what they're doing. And there's only so many ways to get from point A to point B. In that bridge, we're going to make that super unsafe. It is an integral part of war.